The following story is in an unfinished state, and it will never be finished as it is. The Archivist Files, Episode 1, Incite. A very long time ago, in the not-so-distant future, a madman created a game where the lines between reality and fiction blurred, and that would find itself as a staging ground for countless stories, and even one that would leak into reality. But that's a story for another time. This story, however, follows the lesser of two evils fighting to survive. Chapter 1, Fight or Flight. Every footfall sent a shockwave of pain through Miles' shoulder. He had hoped that the thick foliage would hide him from the invisible assailants, but quickly abandoned that thought as an arrow whizzed past his right heel. Miles tightened his grip on the copper short sword in his right hand and looked at his bloodied left. Blood still pooled from his shoulder despite his attempts to hold it. If he wasn't impaled by a spear, the blood loss would certainly take him. He stumbled on a stone, which he quickly thanked as yet another arrow flew through where his head had been just a moment ago. He stopped for a moment to catch his breath. His heart was hammering in his ears. He remembered what he had been told countless times by his instructor. If you're bleeding, slowing your heart rate is your number one priority. Miles began the breathing exercises he had been taught, and his heart began to stabilize and slow its beating. He began to walk again, more slowly and carefully, but the energy he had put into running was now put into his senses. His eyes scanned the dense forest around him, allowing him to narrowly dodge another arrow. He continued to scan the foliage, and uneasiness began to set in. A minute passed, or he thought it did, and no more arrows flew. He let his tenseness dissipate, which he immediately regretted. A rustling sounded behind him, and he whipped his head around just in time to see the tip of a copper spear rushing toward him. And a wild spear that would have angered his instructor, he managed to just barely deflect the point, the spear nicking his right ear. But the attacker was not finished yet. Their momentum sent them crashing towards Miles. There was no time to react, and even less to dodge, and so Miles was knocked to the ground. He tasted blood in his mouth, and felt a pain when he struck. It only took a second for Miles to recollect himself enough to notice his assailant thrusting their spear downwards towards him with a battle cry. This attack was when he managed to dodge, rolling to the side as they plunged their weapon into the earth. The attacker uttered a swear as they pulled their spear from the ground, giving Miles a chance to pull himself up onto his feet. He raised his blade high to strike at the foe, but was halted by a bolt of pain that spread from his shoulder to his entire body, and instead opted to put some distance between the two of them, holding his blade in a simple guard pose. The attacker pulled their spear out of the soil and pointed it at Miles, giving him a good look at the assailant's face for the first time, and he saw that they were in fact not a man as he had assumed, but rather a woman. Whatever, it doesn't change a thing, Miles thought, but the chivalric side of his mind uttered a cry of pain. They circled each other in the uneasy dance of battle. He realized that he had bitten his tongue when he struck the ground, which was the source of the bleeding. They circled each other for a minute, until Miles struck first, delivering a jab that was quickly blocked by the haft of the girl's spear. He quickly dashed backward to again put some distance between the two of them. They circled for another minute, the pain growing in Miles' shoulder. He gripped the wound tighter and glanced at it to see blood still cascading from the wound. He was beginning to feel lightheaded as his heart beat faster. The attacker took his short distraction as a chance to strike, driving her spear towards him with a battle cry, but Miles was expecting her this time. He sidestepped the assault and plunged his blade deep into her chest. She screeched a cry of agony as blood exploded from the wound. Using his foot, he pushed her off his sword. He watched her as she laid on the ground, chest heaving and eyes glaring at him, before a groan sounded from her mouth and then nothing. He crouched down to place his fingers on the side of her neck, checking for a pulse, but found none. I'm sorry, Miles apologized, angry at himself that he had caused another human such pain, but he knew there was no other way. He forced himself to stand despite the pain. He took a deep breath and steeled his nerves. He had ran, but he had sworn an oath, and he had a duty to perform. So he began to walk back the way he came, to where the fighting had started, which was quite easy, given the trail of blood he had left. He had only hoped he wasn't too late to have failed his duty. Miles heard a thud and looked up to see an arrow embedded in a tree trunk high above. Just a second later, he heard another cry where the arrow might have originated from, not too dissimilar for the one he had just caused. He hoped that it was the archer who had cried out, and not a surviving ally. Well, they wouldn't be surviving anymore by the sound of it. He entered the clearing where they had made camp the night before, and his heart nearly stopped in terror as he beheld the sight. The bodies of his comrades and their ambushers lay bloodied and mutilated on the ground. One corpse lay charred on the remnants of the fire. He cursed himself for running and not staying to fight. Perhaps a few of his friends could have survived, but in reality, he knew he would have likely perished as well. His lightheadedness caused him to slump to the ground. He sat against a tree, the only one whose bark was not bloodied by the conflict, free of blood, no more. He could not think properly. The only thought was the knowledge that death was coming for him. Perhaps that thought had summoned death itself, as he heard the rustling of underbrush on the other side of the clearing, and he saw a figure walk from the trees, his vision too blurry to make out friend or foe. The only discernible feature the figure had was a short sword, similar to Miles's own. The figure walked between the corpses, occasionally crouching down, examining them for signs of life, he presumed. Miles tried to lift his sword, but ended up causing himself pain, and instinctively letting out a small cry of pain. The figure seemed to hear him as they turned their head to face him. They stood up from their examination and walked toward him.
Be careful not to overexert yourself, Miles.
The voice that came from the figure's mouth was familiar. Miles squinted as they approached, and he managed to recognize the figure. My king. Miles cried out in concern for the man that he was sworn to protect, and at the sight of a wound in his side that was hastily bandaged with a scrap of cloth. He breathed out a sigh of relief to see that his king was alive. If he wasn't, he would never see retribution. His ruler crouched down on his knees beside him and untied a piece of cloth that was wrapped around his bicep, revealing an arrow wound that seemed to have crusted over, but was still bleeding. Miles mustered a quiet cry of protest, valuing his own life below that of his monarch, but was ignored as his wound was bandaged.
You are far more injured than I, and you can't move. Not with that amount of blood loss.
Miles knew the words he spoke were true, but that did not mean he accepted them. His king pushed himself onto his feet. He watched as his ruler walked away into the forest and away from his sight. And so Miles lay there. He had never been in such immense pain before. It seemed the cloth was the only thing that kept him alive. His vision slowly blurred more and more until he realized he didn't have to stay for this. He used his mind to open the virtual interface and used that to lock out. Alright, I used to be a bad writer, okay? If I did it, it's better than this. Miles pulled the headset off and pushed himself off his bed and into a sitting position. He instantly regretted it, as a bolt of pain was sent through his shoulder, and he instinctively tried to hold the wound, but when he looked, he saw no such wound. Just phantom pain, he thought, a possible side effect of full dive gaming. It should fade in a few minutes. He glanced at his phone and saw it was about mid-afternoon. His stomach growled, and he begrudgingly lifted himself off his bed and walked to the kitchen, his whole body feeling sore, but the feeling was fading already. He swung the door of the refrigerator open, the cold air feeling soothing against his face. He grabbed some leftovers from last night's Chinese and put them in the microwave. Oh, this is dumb. While he was waiting for his food, he received a notification on his phone. "Message from Big Sis," notified the automated voice. He opened the message, and it read, "Just got off work. Wanna hop on Odysseia?" "I think I might have died there," he replied. "What? Really?" came the reply a few moments later. "Yep, but I'm not sure yet. We'll just get back on an hour after. He might not have." "Is an hour really long enough to be sure?" He texted back. "Yeah, remember the thing I told you about? Time dilation, I think they called it. Makes time in the game faster than in the real world." "Right, I do remember. Well, I'll check." "Okay, see you then," his sister replied. The microwave beeped, signifying his meal was ready. He grabbed his food and sat down in front of his computer. Checking his email, he couldn't help but feel disappointed, looking at all the rejection letters he had in his inbox. It looked like Miles would still be out of a job for the foreseeable future. Chapter 2. The Good Samaritan. Tenet stepped over rotting logs and rocks, feeling pleased with himself. He shifted the duck corpse he slung over his shoulder and corrected the orientation of his quiver, the few flint arrows he had left bouncing around with each step. He came to a small creek and crossed it, hopping from stone to stone. He slipped on the last rock, although he managed to catch himself. But he noticed a fluid on his foot. He wiped his finger and brought it up to his nose, and he smelt the strong scent of iron. Combined with the deep red color of the fluid, he could tell what it was. Blood. Tenet quickly examined his body, thinking he might have some unknown wound. Finding none, he unslung the bird from his shoulder and examined it as well. Well, the feathers around the arrow wound were matted with dry blood, and no longer spilled fresh. Puzzled, he looked around and saw that the current carried fresh blood from upstream to his left. He debated with himself for a minute, weighing the risks involved with chasing after blood trails. In the end, curiosity got the better of him. He unslung the bird and secured it more permanently using a piece of cloth. Tenet readied his bow, knocking an arrow in its string. He carefully walked near the stream, his skilled hunting eyes scanning the forest for any sort of attack. After just a few minutes of walking, he noticed a deer watching from the other side of the stream. His subconscious told him to hunt it, but he was on a different mission. A mission that soon came to a close, as he saw, leaning against a tree, a man that seemed to be bleeding from a wound in his side. Tenet rushed forward, prepared to defend himself should it be a trap. The injured man had thick brown hair and only pants, which looked to have been made from high-quality leather. "Sir, are you okay?" he shouted, concern dominating his tone. The man slowly looked up at him.
"So, hungry?"
Tenet realized he was not looking at him, but rather the duck he carried. "I could take you to my encampment, and we can feed you," he offered. The man grunted and stood up fully, which Tenet took to be an exception of his offer. "It's this way." He began to walk in the direction he had come from, downstream, but he had gone only about 10 feet before hearing a thud behind him. He looked back to see the man slumped against a tree. He had moved a few feet, but must have swiftly collapsed. He quickly rushed to the man. "What's wrong? Do you need help to walk?"
"Yes."
Clearly took much effort for the stranger to speak. Tenet slid his arm underneath the man's shoulder and lifted up with all his strength, getting blood on his shirt in the process, and slowly walked alongside the creek to where he had called home. They pushed through the trees to Tenet's camp. Beth was anxiously pacing back and forth. When she saw him, she looked relieved, but when she laid her eyes on the man he carried, her expression changed to one of confusion. "Who on earth is this?" she pressed. "Someone who needs our help." Tennant walked to the center of the camp and sat the stranger on the ground by the fire. "You can't just bring in strays, you don't know what this man's intentions are." Tennant ignored her. "Get me a shirt." Beth scoffed, but nonetheless fetched the requested shirt. Tennant tore the shirt and slowly wrapped the cloth around the man's midsection, careful not to cause any discomfort. "Where's Mont?" "He went to look for you," Beth replied. Tennant untied the duck from his shoulder and took out his flint knife. "What in the name of all that is holy did you get yourself into?" Tennant looked up from stirring the pot of duck soup to see Mont standing at the edge of the camp. "Hello to you too." Mont leaned his spear against the tree and walked over to the fire where they were gathered. Tennant continued to stir the soup with the stranger sitting up next to him. Miraculously, his condition seemed to have improved significantly since his arrival. The bleeding seemed to have stopped for the most part. "Who's this?" questioned Mont. "Somebody who needs our help, apparently. That's what Tennant said anyway." Beth's tone betrayed her annoyance. "No, but what's his name?" The realization that Tennant hadn't gotten the man's name dawned on him. I haven't actually asked." "So you brought him here without even knowing his name?"
I am right here, you know.
The stranger's voice sounded strained. "Right, sorry," came Mont's apology. "And if you don't mind, just what is your name?"
I am King Alphonse of New Valoria.
Tennant and the other's jaws dropped in disbelief. Tennant reassessed the man, looking him up and down. This time he noticed he did have a certain regal air about him. He held his head high and puffed out his chest, but while he carried himself like a ruler, his body was that of a farmer. His hands were covered in calluses, and his muscles ripped across his body, as well as his skin, which was tanned as though he spent his time laboring in the sun. Their mouths continued to gape silently until Mont broke the silence. "A king? Just how big is this New Valoria? A couple dozen people?"
As of the last census, a little over 300.
The bubbling soup and the ambience of the forest became the only sound as they stared in disbelief. Mont's mouth moved as though he tried to formulate words, but he was unable to.
That soup looks ready.
Tennant, broken out of his disbelief, served the soup into clay bowls. I hope it's not too bad for you."
I'm sure I've had worse.
The king reassured. They began to eat their soup in relative silence, still watching the king in disbelief. Thankfully, the silence was broken by Mont, who, in between mouthfuls of duck, asked, "How did you get in the woods with a wound in your side?" Alphonse gulped down his duck before saying,
We, about a dozen guards and myself, were returning from a diplomatic mission from Whiteland, on the other side of the mountain.
He vaguely pointed in the direction of the sun.
When we set up camp and were ambushed in the night, I barely made it out alive, but most of the others were not so lucky.
The trio sat in silence at the rather depressing answer. After a minute, they continued their meal. Alphonse finished his meal before anyone else, and he sat in silence, waiting for the others to finish. When they did, he cleared his throat.
I thank you for the generosity you have shown me, but I have one more task to ask of you, if you are willing.
Tennant wanted nothing more than to help this man. "Of course, what is it? What's in it for us?" Beth chimed in, basically talking over Tennant, earning herself a silent glare from him.
We can give you copper tools and as much food as you wish.
Beth crossed her arms and muttered something under her breath. Tennant didn't hear what. The king continued.
There were a few survivors from our ambush, and I need your help to get them and bring them home.